Hello, and welcome back to Edgier Than Thou. Today I want to talk to you about a PragerU video, which you might notice is probably going to be a bit of a running theme here, but we'll switch it up, don't worry. The video in question was released in 2017 and is hosted by Christina Hoff Sommers. It's entitled, "There Is No Gender Wage Gap," and I shit you not, it takes 1 minute for it to admit that there is a gender wage gap. Now you may be wondering why I want to talk about a 5-year-old PragerU video, but the real reason for that is because what I really want to talk about is an 8-year-old episode of Last Week Tonight. But we'll get to that when we get to it, so let's get started.
If for the same work women only make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes, why don't businesses hire only women? Wages are the biggest expense for most businesses, so hiring only women would reduce costs by nearly a quarter.
Now, of course, there are a variety of reasons for this, but let's just discuss a couple of them. One, having a population that's paid less than another population is really motivating to keep the overpaid population in line because things could always get worse.
You know how I describe the economic and social classes in this country? The upper class keeps all of the money, pays none of the taxes. The middle class pays all of the taxes, does all of the work. The poor are there just to scare the shit out of the middle class. Keep them showing up at those jobs.
This is most notable when we discuss immigration and wages because, while immigrants, on average, tend to increase wages for most people in the native population, the fact that immigrants are paid less and on average tend to be willing to work for less motivates the rest of the population to be terrified of what immigrants could do to the economy. Suddenly, you're less worried about the capitalist underpaying you and more worried about a population you share a lot in common with economically. This is a tactic that goes back centuries. They did the same thing with slaves and white servants, where they made sure that white servants were absolutely terrified of and bigoted towards the slaves because it allowed them to destroy the class consciousness of the slaves and the white servants. Not only that, it seems to be the case that women are literally less valued in the professional sector, which would lead to the perception that they're doing less and thus would demotivate employers from only hiring women. Sources and all that down there. As it turns out, there are actually a lot of reasons to underpay a population without only hiring members of that population.
Don't businesses want to be profitable? Or are they really just bad at math? Well, actually, it's the feminists, celebrities, and politicians spreading this wage gap myth who have the math problem. If the average income of all men is, say, $40,000 a year, and the average annual income of all women is, say, $30,800, that would mean that women earn 77 cents for every dollar a man earns. These calculations don't reveal a gender wage injustice, because they don't take into account occupation, position, education, or hours worked per week.
Okay, this is just a bald-faced lie. Several studies have accounted for all of these different factors, but PragerU knows that they can't challenge that, so they just pretend it doesn't exist, and most of their audience isn't going to look it up.
Even a study by the American Association of University Women, a feminist organization, shows that the actual wage gap shrinks to only 6.6 cents when you factor in different choices men and women make.
Wait, I thought that the feminists didn't study this. 10 seconds ago, you were saying that this data doesn't exist, and now you're literally citing that exact data. I think that the point of this is to say, look, the wage gap is smaller than they implied it was. It's not 23 cents, it's only 6.6 cents. But a 6.6% reduction in your wages is massive. It amazes me that PragerU seems able to get away with flagrantly lying and misrepresenting statistics. May I remind you, this video is titled, "There Is No Gender Wage Gap."
The actual wage gap shrinks to only 6.6 cents when you factor in different choices men and women make. And the key word here is choice. The small wage gap that does exist, the small wage gap that does exist, the small wage gap that does exist, the small wage gap that does exist has nothing to do with paying women less, let alone with sexism. It has to do with differences in individual career choices that men and women make.
Not only are there valid economic reasons to not only hire women despite the fact that they're underpaid, when a field is primarily dominated by women, it just so happens to be the case that the entire field has lower wages on average. The PragerU video literally mentions that this is all actually about choice, and then mentions that women on average tend to choose lower paying jobs, for example, counseling and psychology, early childhood education, social work, you know, silly and pointless jobs. So I hope by now we've established that the wage gap is not even remotely a myth, that you can literally account for all of these factors and a wage gap still exists. But I do want to spend a little bit more time focusing on choice. And this is where Last Week Tonight with John Oliver comes in. See, this is a show that on average, I think is pretty good. It's fairly informative, it's funny about a quarter of the time, and it tends to introduce you to issues that you may never have thought of if you haven't experienced them before. Most episodes of the show will introduce you to some specific issue. Sometimes it's one you've heard of, sometimes it's one you haven't, and it'll outline kind of the basic evidence for why this is an issue, and then it'll discuss solutions. And most episodes end with either some ridiculous, over-the-top gag, or an acknowledgement that the solutions that have been presented in the show are not perfect and won't entirely fix the issue. When they talk about carbon taxes, they acknowledge that climate change isn't only going to be solved by carbon taxes, it's just a single piece of a much larger puzzle. Anyhow, in 2014, they did a show on the wage gap, and when the topic of women making different choices came up, this is what happened.
The second popular argument for why the wage gap is women's fault is that they choose to enter lower-paying professions.
When you compare men and women in the same positions, with the same experience, the same education, there is no pay gap.
OK, apples to apples. OK, well, in which case, I actually have a question for you. How do you like these apples?
A recent study out of Yale University that is interesting, where professors were given the identical resume. One had the name John on the top, and one had the name Jennifer on top. The male candidate was rated more favorably, and
really?
They were offered on average $4,000 more than the female candidate.
Now, on face value, I think this looks like a pretty strong response, right? He establishes that even in the same field, women are still treated worse than men. And he goes on, he recommends legislation to solve the issue, and that's basically the end of the piece, and then they do a dumb little skit afterwards. But upon further inspection, I feel as though this response was inadequate. To that end, I'd like to introduce you to the Scully Effect. Some of you may have already heard of this. The Scully Effect was quantified in 2018 by the Gina Davis Institute, and it essentially shows that women in STEM being represented in media leads to an increase of women in STEM fields. The study revolves around one character from the X-Files, Dr. Dana Scully, who was at the time one of the only positive representations of women in STEM on TV, and essentially discusses and shows how her being represented on television led to women being more interested in STEM fields. And what this study shows, and what I think John Oliver misses, is that choices aren't made in a vacuum. We've established that many of the fields that women predominantly occupy are already underpaid, but that doesn't change the fact that there are fields predominantly occupied by women, and that's interesting, right? Like, why are women choosing all of these different fields? I know some folks like to reduce that all down to biology, right? I guess women just have like an innate biological desire to be social workers and counselors, I guess, and sure, whatever, man. But what the Scully Effect shows, and what I think a lot of us already kind of knew, is that the way that you're treated when you grow up, and the sort of fields that are made available to you, are going to impact the sorts of fields that you're going to choose when you actually get to make that choice. PragerU is right that the choice factors into this discussion, but they're wrong in pretending like that proves that sexism doesn't exist. I'm sure if you're not a woman and you ask around, you can find plenty of women in your life who at some point have been discouraged from picking fields predominantly occupied by men. There's a good chance you'll also be able to find the same for men in your life, right? I mean, there's a reason why we talk about the disadvantages for male nurses. The frustration that I have with this Last Week Tonight episode is that, and I know that it's 8 years old, it's just that it feels like missing this is beneath the show. That they should know that this is at least something worth discussing. And I know that to some degree, right, they have to cut things for time, but the fact that this doesn't even get a passing mention suggests to me that they didn't really think about it. There's a concept in the field of sociology, the sociological imagination, which essentially encourages us to see ourselves not only as individuals, but also as people influenced by the culture surrounding us and the time period in history that we exist in. Recognizing that who we are, our desires, our goals, our impressions, our opinions would be different if we were raised in a different society. That who we are doesn't exist in a vacuum. And it frustrates me because legislation isn't the only thing that's going to fix this. We also need a cultural shift towards more positive and beneficial representations of women and men in different fields. And it feels like maybe part of the reason why this wasn't addressed is because to some degree it might feel like it's offensive, right? It feels like it's wrong to acknowledge that they might technically, on some level, have a point here when they say the choice factors into the discussion. But the truth is, the conservatives saying that choice is the issue, are wrong. They're full of shit. They are introducing this for disingenuous reasons. They just want you to shut up. But there is technically a grain of truth to that issue, and if we don't address it, then the problem will never be solved. But let's acknowledge that legislation isn't the only thing that's going to fix this problem. We also have to address the way that we interact with the world and the way that the people around us interact with the world. It's not enough to just say, well, the law says that women should be paid equally. We need to recognize that the comments that we make to people in our life are going to influence the path of their life, whether we like it or not. When you make snide comments about male nurses or women in science, you're contributing to the problem. You can't just say that you supported the legislation and call it there. You need to be able to introspect and recognize that the things that you say may be contributing to the reason why there are so few women in STEM and other higher paying fields. So all that to say, PragerU is lying. John Oliver was like kind of wrong here, and I appreciate you sitting through all of this. But with that, thumb button, subscribe button, See you in the next one. Peace out, losers.